Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to be painting this glowing sunset scenery. I tried to look for another reference image which has many layers of vegetation to try to figure out how to simplify it into a painting as practice to try to not overwork it this time. And I'm going to begin by masking off the sides so I can create a cleaner frame. This is the reference image that I'll be using. As you can see, there are many layers of vegetation. So before painting, I had to figure out the layering process so I can depict a little bit of depth in the painting. And I'm just going to sketch out the main elements here so I can divide up the space for an even composition. As you can see, I'm just sketching out very loosely and lightly. Here I want to indicate the foreground where the large trees will be and how the leaves will flop over to the right hand side of the composition. I'm also going to figure out the space for the water, the land on the right, and also a rough estimation of the horizon line for the background. I also want to make sure that the angles of the tree trunks will complement the composition. And yeah, these are basically the things that I tried to figure out during the stage, so I know where to paint certain colors and more importantly, when to stop painting in a certain area. Okay, so that's it for the sketching portion. Next, I'm going to go over the colors. Firstly, this is Buff Titanium by Daniel Smith, Indigo by Schmincke, Yellow Ochre by Holbein, New Gamboge by Daniel Smith, Quin Sienna by Daniel Smith, Terre Verte by Holbein, and I'm also going to finish up with a little bit of Bleedproof White by Dr. P.H. Martins. I'm going to start by painting the background. I used basically tinted water with a little bit of New Gamboge. I'm actually going to spread this out throughout most of the painting while avoiding the tree trunks, the land area on the right, as well as the foreground on the left. So I'm basically painting over the leaves of the tree as well as the background and the water. Next, I'm going to add Quin Sienna into the mixture with a little bit of yellow ochre as well to mute the color slightly. And I'm going to use this to paint the background or the blurry background while the surface is still a little bit damp. I'm going to paint on some trees. I'm also using a medium consistency here, so the color is not overly saturated. And I'm also going to paint in between the tree trunks since we're going to be able to see a little bit of the background there. Under the trees, I'm going to extend it by adding a little bit of New Gamboge into the previous mixture to make it more of a yellowy color. And I'm also going to add more details underneath by using a muted color from a mix of Quin Sienna and a little bit of indigo. I didn't really want to include too much detail for the background, so I am still painting on the damp surface, making sure that everything looks blurry. And I'm actually not looking at the reference at this point, I just want to place the darker colors randomly. Next, I'm going to continue on to the right side of the composition, which is the marshy area. Here I'm using a really light yellow color from a mix of New Gamboge, a little bit of Quin Sienna, and a touch of Terre Verte. I'm placing it as a few separate layers while leaving white areas in between. Then I'm going to continue this down with a muted green color from a mix of Terre Verte, Quin Sienna with a touch of indigo. You may also notice that I switched to my small brush here so it doesn't hold too much water and I can control the placement of the paint in smaller areas. I don't want this green to touch the bottom layer of the yellow that I painted earlier because I want to continue down by adding a bit more Quin Sienna into the green mix. I also want to place this underneath the yellow area that I painted earlier. Then I use the dark brown mix, which has more indigo in the ratio, to continue downwards to separate those two layers again. As I continue to the lower part, you'll see that the color will become more green. And for this, I just added Terre Verde into the mixture and I continue it downwards. As I get to the lower part, I also want to darken the value by adding more indigo, and I'm also using a thicker consistency. In terms of the application, as you can see, I'm creating sort of like grassy texture. And I know since I'm painting or continuing downwards on a wet surface, certain areas are just going to blur out, but I do want to make sure that the edges have a little bit of that grassy texture. Here I'm going to continue to build on the value, so I added more indigo as well as Quin Sienna into the green, and I'm placing this right at the edge of the water. Next, I'm going to start painting the base color of the tree using buff titanium by itself. I'm painting the bottom part of the tree trunk with it. Then I'm going to continue upwards using the previous really dark brown mix from Quin Sienna and Indigo for the top part of the branch and connect it downwards. And since that area where it's overlapping in front of the background will be the glowy area, I'm also going to introduce some oranges from a mix of Quin Sienna and New Gamboge. I'm not going to paint the small branches for now. Instead, I'm going to paint the base color of the tree. I want this to be a dark muted green color from a mix of Terre Verde, Quin Sienna, and Indigo, but I'm also using a really light consistency since I'm still painting the background. Sometimes I like to alternate the colors so certain areas have a bit more Quin Sienna. This is just to create a little bit of interest, but it doesn't really matter too much since we are going to be painting over it with the details. As I move slowly downwards, I'm going to add a lighter green, so I just added more Terre Verde and New Gamboge in the mixture and continue on. Just like before, I like to switch it up, so here I'm using the darker green again to just dot some darker values around. And on the right hand side, this is where I'm going to start adding a bit of the yellows. So I'm still using the same part of my palette, but I just added New Gamboge to the orangey yellow mixtures, and I'm painting this around where the leaves are going to droop down. After I finish painting around that area, I'm going to go back to the light yellow green, which has more Terre Verde in the mixture, and I'm just going to paint it inside the yellow area. Notice that I'm leaving out some white negative space here and there so it doesn't look too bulky as well, since I'm still going to be layering on more of the darker values later on. For the portion on the right, that's where the background is going to be, so I added more indigo into my palette, and I'm just going to place it over that small area where I've left white, and I'm also going to extend this upwards to separate the leaves at the front and the background. Next, I'm going to move to the left side of the composition. Here I'm using Quin Sienna, Indigo, and Yellow Ochre, and I'm going to paint a little bit of the textures on the tree. I'm just going to indicate the lighter colors here, which is why the color is really off compared to the reference image, but I just want to place it on to remind myself to not use too dark of a value later on. As for the bottom portion, I'm using a medium consistency of buff titanium with a little bit of yellow ochre. Then I added a little bit of Quin Sienna and also indigo for the darker values. I'm just using the tip of my brush to flick my brush up and down and also sideways, creating different textures while the surface is still a little bit damp. Then I'm going to move on to the top section where the vegetation is a little bit more green, but I'm using this orangey yellow mix for the top part to create the glow, then continue downwards with more yellow green and the darker green from the same mixtures before as the tree. While I wait for the left side to settle, I'm going to move back to the right hand side where I'm going to extend the marsh area over to the left to be closer to the tree trunks. I started with the yellow mixture to create the glow, and as I move downwards, I switch to the dark muted green. Here I just went back to the left really quickly to add more of the finer textures. For the area behind the tree on the left, I'm starting with the orangey mix from Quin Sienna and New Gamboge to paint parts of the sky. Then I'm going to continue this by adding a little bit of the green mixture at the top of my palette with New Gamboge to the same mixture in a thick consistency and extend this downwards for some of the bushy textures. Just like the marshy area, I'm doing a couple of layers here and leaving out a bit of negative space so I can extend the color downwards using the darker muted green, which has more indigo in the mix. Since the yellow green for the top part is fairly thick, I decided to break it up with the darker green. Then I'm going to add more of a muted yellow green for the bottom to make sure I separate these bushes to the foliage at the front in the foreground. I'm just going to wait for that section to settle and move on to paint the water area. I'm starting out by wetting the surface evenly. Then I use a mix of indigo, Quin Sienna, and a little bit of Terre Verte that was already on my palette to create this muted greenish brown color. I'm painting horizontally to create the water texture. Then I'm also going to add the glowy orange mix with Quin Sienna and New Gamboge to paint underneath the marshes and also parts of the left side of the water texture that I've painted earlier. Since the muted brown turned out to be a bit too light, I ended up painting over it again with this orange mix. Then I'm going to continue to paint the darker browns again on top, on the right side only, while leaving a bit off the orangey part on the left, since I can see that my paper can still take more paint at this point. While I'm applying the paint though, I'm still painting horizontally to depict the water texture. The paper is now really wet, so I'm going to move to another area, which is the background. At the top of my palette, I have the orange mix and the dark brown. I'm going to use those two colors to create an in-between color that's still mostly orangey. And I'm going to use this to paint some bushy textures for the background. Then I'm just going to use a clean damp brush to pull it down to the water surface. After that, I'm going to completely dry it off with a hair dryer and add more details. I'm adding the tips or the edges for the background, and I want this to be kind of blurry. So after using the orangey color, I use a clean damp brush to soften the edges, and I'm just going to keep layering on more detail using the orangey mix and the dark brown mix while trying to vary the tone slightly as I'm adding on the layers. I feel like the middle ground and the foreground is fairly dry now, so I'm going to layer on more of the details, and you can see the colors have faded a little bit. So I'm repainting the glow for the top part of the marshes using the orange mix from Quin Sienna and New Gamboge. And just like before, I'm going to continue down with the muted dark brown mixtures, but this time I'm using a lighter brush load to create finer edges for the textures as I'm painting on the marsh areas. On the right hand side here, as it's getting further and deeper into the marshes, I added more indigo in the mixture to create a darker brown. We've left out the trees for a while now, so here I'm just painting on a few of the large branches. Then I'm going to work on the glow for the leaves. I'm using the same mixture as before from New Gamboge and Quin Sienna. I added more New Gamboge if I wanted the color to be a little bit more golden yellow, especially on the right hand side. This time I'm painting smaller leaf textures on top of the base color. Next, I'm going to work on the darker leaves, so I'm just going to add more Terre Verte and indigo on my palette. As I'm looking at the reference image, a lot of the darker tones are on the top left part of the tree, so I'm just going to place on more leaf textures, but I'm going to leave out some white negative space so you can still see parts of the base color peeking through. Just like before, I like to play with the tonal value, so sometimes I like to use a ratio which has more Terre Verte in the mix for a lighter green. While some of the green leaves are still a little bit damp, I'm going to continue this down with the orangey mix from earlier, so there's a nicer blend between those two colors. While I wait for that part to settle, I'm going to move on to the right side of the tree. I'm using a light yellow-green mixture from Terre Verte and New Gamboge to paint the sides closer to the yellow area. I'm also looking at the reference image here to figure out where to place those values. I can see from the reference image that the top part of the right corner is quite dark. So I'm going to use the previous mixture, which has a little bit of indigo in the ratio, to continue painting the leaf shapes as I get towards the top, while the surface of the lighter yellow-green is still a little bit damp, so there's a nicer natural flow between those two color mixtures. And because this area is quite dense, I find that it helps to draw out some of the finer branches, so I know where to place the leaves, and I just find that it looks more intentional this way rather than just mindlessly placing the leaf textures like I did on the top left side, which can make the tree look a bit too dense, especially when I'm still layering on more colors. After painting the greens, I can see that there's a huge separation in the colors between the glowy leaves and the green leaves, so I use my orange mixture with added Terre Verte to find a color in between to paint more leaves around the edges of the green leaves. I'm also painting them with intention by drawing out the branches and the leaves growing on either side. As I'm adding more leaves, at the top I felt like these areas look a bit too crowded, so I ended up taking off some of the details by wetting the surface and taking off the reactivated paint using tissue. After that, I'm going to paint over that area using a lighter green so it doesn't look too heavy and dense. And on the left side of the tree, I'm going to treat it the same way as I did for the right by adding more of the glowy colors around the edges of the leaves. I feel like the bottom area here is a bit too blurry, so I'm just using the yellow-green mixture to paint some more detailed leaf textures. For the top part of the tree, where there's a lot of the darker values, I like to blur them out so it doesn't look too detailed, so our eyes can focus more on the focal point, which is where the background is and the glowy area is. And to blur out some of the details, I like to just use a clean damp brush and spread the color around. Ideally, it's better to just not paint too much in the first place, but I'm still trying to find balance between the two. But basically, with this blurry texture instead of the super detailed leaves, we can also pay a bit more attention to the finer branches, which I painted on using a thick consistency mix of Quin Sienna and Indigo. Now moving back to the tree trunk, I'm using a mix of sepia, indigo, and a little bit of yellow ochre in a thin consistency to paint the base color. But for the right hand side of the tree, I'm going to add more Quin Sienna in the mix to make the sides look more glowy. While the surface of the tree trunks are still a bit damp, I'm going to add the darker values, and this is just to separate each of those trees. After that, I'm just going to quickly dry it with a hair dryer. Then I want to use the darker value. This is from a mix of indigo and Quin Sienna to separate the tree further by using a thicker consistency. I'm also going to use this darker color to figure out the edges of the tree, making it look a little bit more rugged and uneven. And of course, for the tree on the right, I'm going to add more new Gamboge and Quin Sienna to make it more glowy, especially for the top part of the tree trunk and the lower branches. Once the base color is completely dry, I'm also going to add some markings on the tree. While doing this, I'm creating random marks, but I'm following the curvature of the tree trunk, and this will just help enhance the form of the tree trunk. After that, I'm going to go back to the texture of the water. I'm going to begin by wetting the surface of the water again. My water is a little bit dirty here, but that's okay. I'm just going to take off some of the excess paint on the left-hand side using tissue. Then on the bottom right-hand side, I'm going to create more of those water texture by painting the horizontal lines using a mix of indigo and Quin Sienna. I want to make sure that there is still a little bit of space in between those lines, and I'm also varying the length. Next, I'm going to move back to the foliage under the trees. Before doing this though, I want to make sure that the background of the foliage is completely dry so the lines will stay nice and crisp. For the foliage, I'm using a mix of new Gamboge, Quin Sienna, and a bit of Terre Verte to create a golden but slightly muted color. And I'm painting using quite a thick consistency and a medium to dry brush load, so I can paint on really thin stems and small leaves. For the foliage behind the tree, I like to add a little bit of indigo to mute the color further, since this area is hidden from the light. I'm also using a heavier brush load, so the lines, as you can see, are not as clear because I'm going to layer on more of the detailed leaves on top. And before I do that, I want to completely dry it off. And for the top layer, I'm using a darker value with more indigo and Quin Sienna in the mixture. Below the really dark foliage, I'm also going to follow this up by adding the grassy texture underneath using the same color. To add a bit more detail, I'm using the same dark green mixture with a little bit of new Gamboge and Quin Sienna in the mix and a dry brush load to create really sharp details for the grass area at the bottom. And I'm also going to use a dry brush texture to paint some abstract details for the foreground. At this point, I'm just going to add smaller details, so I'm using my small brush here to add more foliage around the marsh and also more of the leaves in the foreground. I'm also going to fix up the value here, so I ended up glazing over it using any of the colors or the browns that I already have on my palette. So basically, this is the final adjustments that I'm going to make. I'm also going to add more finer leaf textures surrounding the main trees and also around the tree trunk. This way I feel like the way the leaves fall or grow out of the tree looks a bit more natural. To paint the leaves in front of the tree trunks, I'm going to use the darker brown mix, and I'm just picking up whatever color I already have on my palette, but this probably just has more indigo and Quin Sienna in the ratio. I'm using this color and treating it the same way as I did for the foliage underneath the tree. I'm using the dark color since the light is not hitting this area, and as I get towards the side of the tree trunks where the light is showing through, I'm going to switch to more of the golden color. To give more of a glowy effect, I ended up using the mix of Quin Sienna and new Gamboge in a light to medium consistency to glaze over the left side of the marshes. I decided to add more details to the branches, so I erased parts of the leaves by reactivating the paint using a clean wet brush and then taking off the excess paint. And I'm also going to add some of the finer branches around the drooping area of the trees. For the leaves which are peeking through the golden area, but the background is already the golden brown mix, I'm going to add indigo in the mixture to make it a little bit darker so it still stands out against the background, but it still looks nice and glowy. Lastly, I'm going to add a little bit of detail or highlights with bleed-proof white for the water area. This is not necessary because I feel like the white is a bit too bright. It's better to leave out the white off the paper. So if you have some masking fluid, this is something that you can mask off at the beginning of the painting. And I also decided to add more of the glowy leaf textures on the left side of the leaves by using the same light green mixture as before, but I added bleed-proof white as the base color, so the lighter colors will still show through on top of the darker values on the background. After that, I'm going to take off the tape to unmask and reveal the painting. I really want to exaggerate more of the glow, so here I'm glazing more of the orange mixture on top of the marsh. And that's pretty much it for this painting. Honestly, I quite like how this one looks despite overworking some areas like the leaves, but I feel like I've captured the glow that I wanted. If you guys are new here and enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing for more content like this. Like usual, all the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in my description box. If you guys are still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!